Hey guys, here is a quick overview of Chapter 8 in Module 8. And in this chapter, we're talking about teaching academic skills. So for this lecture, we're going to briefly talk about how academic skills relate to kids that have emotional and behavior disorders. We're going to talk about a couple of categories of academic interventions. We're going to talk about some strategies that have been used to teach just your basic academic content, so math, reading, writing, etc. We're going to talk about adapting the curriculum and instruction, and then wrap it up with reinforcement and how to provide students with opportunities to respond, so that way you can set them up for success and reinforce those behaviors. Okay, so just some general information. If you guys think back to your definition of an EBD, it's an inability to learn that cannot be explained by other factors. And typically these kids are pretty low in their academic skills. So the research shows that they're about 1 to 2 years below their grade level. And because they're so low, a lot of times that results in those behavior problems that we talked about in previous chapters, in that either the course level is too hard and they're just not up to it. And oftentimes it results in, so if the course level is too hard, they're more likely to engage in problem behaviors that are escape maintained, get out of the classroom, and not have to do the work, essentially. And if they are 1 to 2 years below their grade level, then that academic information is really hard, and a lot of times they're more likely to drop out of school. So this results in a lower graduation rate for kids with EBD, and also a higher chance of being unemployed after graduation. And a lot of times teachers have this idea that we should focus on the behavior problems before we talk about academic skills. So the behavior problems are coming in the way of teaching academic skills. And I want you guys to think about not just, taking care of the behavior problem and then teaching academic skills, but actually doing those two things together. So you can work on behavior management in addition to working on academic skills. And that can be really beneficial for kids that have EBD because, they do have a lot of problem behavior. And if you just focus on the problem behavior, then you're not actually focusing on any type of academic skill, which results in them being below their grade level. Okay, so when you're teaching academic material, just a couple of things about children with EBD. They want to be successful in school. And so like we just talked about, a lot of times they have problem behaviors that get in the way. So they oftentimes have an inability to kind of regulate their problem behaviors. So, teaching them academic skills does take more effort on the part of the teacher because you have to deal with behavior management and you also have to teach academic skills. So just kind of keep that in mind. But they do want to be successful, and they can be successful. So if you set up your classroom to be really structured, this shows that this provides the most success for them in reducing any type of problem behavior and allowing them to focus on academic skills. So we've talked about classroom management plans and other modules. So if you guys have a classroom management plan, and whatever you guys do, whatever plan you decide to implement, consistency is key. So just make sure that you're consistent. And if you're consistent, then that creates that really structured learning environment. If you have a structured learning environment, that increases predictability, which allows them to know when they're transferring from English to math, when they're going to lunch, all those things. If everything in your classroom management plan is consistent, then that produces that structured environment, which decreases your problem behavior and allows them to focus on academic skills. A lot of times your kids with EBD just need more intensive strategies. So, making sure that you are, decreasing that problem behavior, but also really using more intensive strategies with teaching those academic skills. Because remember, they're 1 to 2 grade levels typically below. And because of this, they typically don't receive the instruction that they need. It's hard for teachers when they have 25 kids in their classroom to really manage classroom behavior and not only provide academic teaching to these kids, but provide a more intensive strategy to these kids. So it can just be really hard. A lot of teachers aren't trained, even in classroom management, as well as these more intensive strategies. So it just kind of results in these kids typically not receiving the instruction that they need. Before we get into, categories of academic interventions and some strategies, I wanted to talk about the relationship between the teacher and the student. And we talked about this in previous modules, I think, but having a really positive relationship between you and the student is key to the student not wanting to engage in a problem behavior and being more likely to engage in your actual lesson. And here are a couple of things that have been shown that you guys can do to help engage the student. First of all, showing enthusiasm for the subject matter. So being excited about what you're teaching about, and also making the subject matter real for the students. So this requires you as a teacher to know, essentially, sorry guys, I had a little cough. This allows you to know what's going on in the world and be relevant as to what's going on in the world. So I remember when I was teaching, it was an intro to psych class, and it was a couple years ago. Anyways, we were talking about mate selection, and I used the example of Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, and the kids just didn't know what I was talking about. Well, they were either really little or weren't alive when that happened. I also used, sadly, the example of 9/11, and they were also just, I didn't realize how little they were, and some weren't born when 9/11 actually happened. So just making sure that it was a good lesson for me to make sure that I'm current in the world and I'm actually providing examples that connect to their lives. Providing encouragement for students, so indicating that you believe in them. Asking leading questions to promote success. So asking questions that are easy, that you know that they can be successful in answering them, that gives you an opportunity to provide some reinforcement and increase that positive relationship. Providing options and choices for students to have some control over learning. Whenever you allow students to have some control over their learning environment, you see that problem behavior actually decreases and anxiety decreases, and they're more likely to be engaged in what they're doing. So you want to make sure that your choices are equal, so that what the student selects doesn't affect instruction. For example, if you have 4 centers set up that you're going to rotate around, maybe figuring out how to give the students a choice as to what center they want to start with first. That way they all get the centers, it's just they get to choose which one they start with. So it provides them that control. Delivering praise in a genuine manner. Kids can detect if you're being sarcastic at all, or if you're not being genuine. Sorry guys, that was my cell phone. Alright, next, let's see. Finally, make sure that you're delivering correction in a neutral manner. So your praise is delivered in a really genuine manner that shows that you really care about the students. But when you deliver correction, which you will be when you're teaching academic skills, you want to make sure that you deliver it in a really neutral tone. So you don't want to sound like you're agitated with the kid or you're frustrated. Make it very neutral so that they kind of realize that it's not personal. And then that praise they get, that's just really genuine. And those relationships between you and the student will really start to develop in a positive way. Okay, so let's talk about some categories of academic interventions. So there are kind of 3 main categories. The first category is teacher-mediated interventions. So these are interventions where the teacher is responsible for implementing the intervention. The other one is peer-mediated, where you have peers that implement the intervention. And then the last one is child-mediated, where the child actually, or the learner actually mediates the intervention. So I wanted to talk about teacher-mediated first really quickly. So one example of teacher-mediated intervention is what we call direct instruction. And so with direct instruction, what typically happens is you introduce the lesson, you model the lesson, demonstrate it, and explain it. you guide student practice, then you're going to facilitate independent practice, and then you want to assess for mastery or remediation. And so if you guys look at this picture, if you have a really complex skill, this shows that what they've done is they've broken this complex skill into 3 different components, and you want to use this direct instruction to teach each component. So once component 1 is taught and mastered, then you move on to component 2, then component 3, and then your last target, which would be your actual complex skill. And so a lot of times you have to do this with kids with EBD, and that you have a really complex skill, because remember, they're below their academic grade level. So you have to think about the prerequisites and what goes into that skill, and you want to break it up into however many component skills you think they need and start using direct instruction. And a couple of things with each of these regarding direct instruction. So whenever you introduce the lesson, you want to make sure that you tell the student what, how much, and why. And this is when you want to connect it to the past and the future. So you want to essentially introduce the lesson, tell them why it's important, and connect it to something that they previously learned, or some type of big idea or anchor role that you have in the classroom. Then you want to model, demonstrate, and explain. So you're going to explain with examples, and you want to show and tell these examples through real demonstrations. So you want to get up there, you want to demonstrate it, you want to engage the students with questions, prompts, hands-on activities. At the end of this lecture, we're going to talk about opportunities to respond, and so that's where this comes in. And then you want to have the students practice. So you want to use examples that allow for a high rate of success. So really easy examples first so that they can be successful. And then you want to repeat that practice every day rather than have just one big mass practice at one time. So providing smaller, more frequent ways for students to practice these skills as opposed to just a big mass practice session. And then you want to facilitate authentic and independent practice. So you want to teach exceptions to the rule, provide prompts out of practice, and then make sure that if you do provide prompts and do things like that, then you want to make sure that you fade out those prompts. You also want to provide feedback, so provide reminders. Whenever they're practicing independently, provide them with feedback. Remember, if you're giving them any type of criticism, remember that it's done in a neutral manner. And then finally, assess for that mastery or remediation. So continually assess over time until you know that they've actually mastered the skill. And if they haven't mastered it, you want to go ahead and reteach and things like that. So if they haven't mastered, go back to reteaching. And if they are successful, then you can go to the next component in the skill. Okay, so that's kind of your direct instruction, the teacher-mediated ways. You can also have peer-mediated ways. So like I said earlier, this is when a student or a peer functions as a coach, and they're paired with a classmate that is lower performing. So you typically have a higher performing classmate paired with a lower performing classmate. The higher functioning student is the coach, and the lower functioning student is actually the player. And you can do games with this. You can do a lot of different things. Kids really like working with their peers, which increases social skills and some things that we talked about in previous models. But one of the main things is the PALS reading program, or the PALS program. And so these are just peer-assisted learning strategies. In the PALS program, especially with reading, a lot of times the students complete 3 activities. So first you have a partner reading, and so the coach or that higher functioning student will actually read the assigned text, and then the lower functioning student or the player is going to read it after the coach reads it. And basically when the player is finished reading it, they're going to retell the text in their own words to the coach. And I hope you guys do this when you study as well. I know I try and do it. It takes a little bit more time, but it's really effective. So reading a paragraph in your textbook or in your readings, and then take a break and restate that paragraph in your own words to yourself. It can be really, really effective, and it helps you memorize or learn the information, essentially. After that, there's the paragraph shrinking. So essentially, you're going to kind of summarize the paragraph. So basically, you're identifying the main idea and things like that. And then the last step in this is called prediction relay. So basically, the player will predict what will happen next. And so this allows them to kind of ensure that they've comprehended the reading and things like that, and that they can actually predict or have a guess as to what is going to happen next. And then there's also a type of PALS program or program form math as well. Okay, the last category that I wanted to address, like we talked about earlier, is the child-mediated. And this is something that's called a personalized system of instruction. This was actually based off of Skinner's operant learning in psychology. And it was designed by a guy named Keller, or it was kind of promoted by a guy named Keller. And basically, students would come in. It's very similar to, if you guys have ever looked up a flipped classroom, it's very similar to a flipped classroom. So the kids would come in and they would be assigned reading, and they would sit there and they would read it. And the teacher and typically a TA would walk around. When the kids felt like they had gone through a lesson, they would take an exam. After they passed the exam or passed it with 80%, then they would get a lecture on the exam. So the lecture is actually used as a reinforcer. And it depended on, how fast the child actually determined how fast they made it through the material. So, they could go through a couple lessons per day, they could drag it out. It was kind of up to them. And in y'all's module, you guys have some examples of the personalized system of instruction. And there's a video of a guy in there that uses it in the college classroom. And it's really interesting because I think he's adapted it for this, online environment that we're in now. So I hope you guys read it. He's a little high-strung and kind of all over the place, but I think he has a good idea of, or he demonstrates and talks about how he actually used it in a college classroom in an online format. So it's actually pretty interesting. Okay, so now let's talk about some strategies to teach just your basic academic content. And for reading especially, one of the main basic intervention strategies is collaborative strategic reading. So this allows students to, comprehend what they're reading, essentially. So here is kind of a visualization of your CSR strategy. So before the reading, you're going to do a little preview. So you're going to read the title, the subwords, the keywords. You're going to brainstorm what you already know and predict what you will learn. And so you can see this connection to the direct instruction and brainstorming what I already know. So if you guys remember with the direct instruction, you're introducing the lesson and you're kind of telling them why it's important and connecting it to something that they've already learned. And so that's what this reading strategy does. And then during the reading, you're going to click and clunk. So look for chunks. Use fix-up strategies. So reread a sentence. Look for the prefix, the suffix, and the word and the root word, and things like that. Continually during the reading, you're going to talk about getting the gist. So this is kind of summarizing it. What's the most important aspect to what you're reading? What's the most important information that you need to remember? So this is when you're kind of summarizing the information and restating it in your own words. And then afterwards, you're going to wrap up. So review it, identify the most important information, and things like that. And this technique has been really shown to be really beneficial for reading comprehension. All right. For language and writing, you can use something called a dialogue journal. Sorry, guys, a dialogue journal. Basically, language skills are just really important prerequisite skills for all other academic skills. They're prerequisite skills for reading and math and science and social studies, and they're even prerequisite skills for social skills. So learning how to converse with language and writing is really, really important. So you can have these dialogue journals where the kid writes a journal entry as much as they want, and then the teacher kind of goes back and responds. And here are some examples. And then in math, you can do a couple of different things. So a lot of times manipulatives are used. You guys, I got a picture right here of a manipulative. And I remember using the little squares for the hundreds grids when I was learning fractions and things like that. Peer tutoring, also, like we talked about, the peer mediated strategies. And then you can also use organizational strategies. So cue cards, which are flashcards, which is right here. Graphic organizers. So sometimes getting the kids to organize the information visually can be really, really helpful. And in the module, there's a couple of examples for you guys to look at. And then there's also a website where you can do graphic organizers online, which is pretty cool. And then you can also use mnemonics. And I know, coming from a psych background, we use mnemonics all the time. So I would say this doesn't actually just apply to math. This applies to reading and everything else. But I remember we used to say for, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally and things like that. So if you can bring in mnemonics, and I would have to make a comment about mnemonics, make sure that you don't have too many mnemonics. So you want enough to where they remember them, but you don't want to overload them with mnemonics. When I studied for my certification exam for being a behavior analyst, there was a book that you could buy, and it was huge. And it was called How to Pass the Big ABA Exam. And for every topic, they had a mnemonic. And some of them didn't make sense, and it was just really confusing. And I thought, I'm going to have to study these mnemonics, and that's really not what they're designed to do. So just kind of keep that in mind. Okay. I wanted to briefly touch on adapting the curriculum and instruction. So your book talks about the universal design for learning, and this has been a huge push in education. So back in the traditional way of teaching, the teacher would design the lesson for your typical average kid, and then your kids that had special ed, they would come in and they would have kind of accommodations and modifications. So the teacher would teach the lesson and accommodate the lesson or modify the lesson afterwards if the kid needed it. Well, the universal design for learning is talking about presenting the lesson from the beginning in a bunch of different modalities and a bunch of different ways. So that way it doesn't matter who you're teaching to, all students will be successful. And therefore you won't need those really accommodations and modifications because they'll get it from your original lesson. And I have actually, I think, two TED Talks in your module about universal design for learning, what it is, how you use it, and things like that. So please make sure and check those out. It's really interesting. It allows you to reach more students, and we're trying to incorporate this in our classes as well. I try to do it within my modules and giving you guys videos and then sometimes websites and sometimes documents. So that way you guys have a couple different resources. So whichever one is, if you have a barrier to one of those, then you can have another resource that you can learn the material from. So keep that in mind when you guys are teaching. Also, there is, a difference between accommodations and modifications, and you guys probably will have these if you're teaching. I know you guys are teaching already, so you have experience with these, but you guys can kind of read the differences between your accommodations and your modifications. Accommodations are typically just changes to the delivery of instruction, the method of your student performance, or how you're actually going to assess the students. So they don't actually change the content or difficulty level of what you're teaching, whereas modifications will actually do that. So here are just some examples of some accommodations and then some, sorry guys, and some modifications. All right, and I wanted to mention, don't forget about reinforcement. So if the kid is engaging in a correct behavior, reinforce it. A lot of times as teachers, I think general in the world, we expect people to behave appropriately, but we forget that we have to provide a reinforcer, or we have to reinforce those behaviors for them to actually increase. So if you have a kid with emotional behavior disorders and you see them engaging in a correct social skill or a correct academic skill, reinforce it. Reinforcement increases the positive relationship between you and that student. It lets them know that they're doing something right, and it's just a really great thing to do. It will increase those positive behaviors as well if it actually is reinforcement. So don't forget to reinforce correct behaviors. Like I said, if you have a kid with EBD and he engages in something correct or a correct academic skill, don't just think to yourself, well, he should have been doing that all along. Go in there and reinforce it. And if it is reinforcement, then the future probability of that behavior will increase, and his academic skills will increase, his social skills will increase. So reinforcement is key to getting a target skill to increase. So don't forget about it. And finally, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about engaging students through opportunities to respond. So using opportunities to respond in your classroom allows the students, they have to be engaged in the lesson and understand what's going on to respond. So in this, the teacher will introduce the lesson, tell those interesting stories, select examples, and then remember when we talked about modeling, this is where you can start to engage the students and give them an opportunity to respond. And I have some videos for you guys. If you look at your slides, you can actually watch them. But here's a couple of different ways that you can use opportunities to respond. You can do verbal responses. So to an individual kid, who can tell me the name of the sign? Or when you're providing an example, Fred, do you think this is right? You can do crowd responding, where the whole class has to respond. And there are a couple of crowd responding programs out there if you guys are interested in this. One example is Language for Learning. So basically, instead of an individual responding to your example, the whole class is responding. And so you'll do something like, typically when you do crowd responding, you want to have some type of signal. So you'll say something like, when I show the answer, everyone who thinks it is right will say yes. You show the answer, everybody says yes. Or the more typical one, when I snap my fingers, everyone will say the name of the sign. You snap your fingers and everybody says the name. So it's a good way to get all of your kids to verbally respond in the classroom. You can do action, so put your finger on the picture of the last test tube, so letting them actually, do something and engage. You can use response cards, so hold up your green card if you think this is right, red if you don't. Using whiteboards also is an example of a response card. You can also use what we call, I never got a chance to use these because my classes are actually too big, but I have them in my cart on Amazon to order, and whenever we get back in the classroom, I'm going to use these, but they're called plickers, so Plickers, I think. So go on Amazon and look them up, or you can look them up in general. But basically, they look like barcodes, and the way the kid turns them, they'll answer A, B, C, or D, A, B, C, or D. So, and what you do is, so you'll ask the class a question, they hold up their plicker, and it's turned a certain way for A, B, C, or D, and then you scan the class with your cell phone, and it will automatically pull the answers. It's all anonymous, and you can see if the class is actually responding correctly. So they're really cool. They're different. Kids typically like them. You get to use your cell phone, which, they love their phones and things like that. And then you can also do demonstration. So have everybody write it down on their paper, everybody work the problem on your whiteboard, and things like that. And these are really good opportunities to respond. If you monitor them, it can give you a really good example of how engaged your kids are in the lesson, which is important for kids with EBD, because if they're not engaged, then they're not learning. So being aware of monitoring your opportunities to respond, if they're responding and things like that, is really important. So you can look at time on task. You can look at opportunities to respond, the ratio of interactions, and then disruptions. If you're on the dark side when you measure these, then you got to stop and do something different. If you're on the medium side, then you might want to watch it and typically possibly do an intervention. And if you're on the light side, then you're doing awesome. So what this means is you want to kind of look at how much time they're on task. And we've talked about different ways to record this. You can do interval recording, things like that. If the kid is on task less than 80%, you're in the dark. 80, 90%, then you're cautionary. But most of the time, then you're good. Opportunities to respond. If you have fewer than 10, or if the kid responds fewer than 10, then you need to do something or change up your opportunities to respond or something like that. If he responds 10 to 40 times, you're cautionary. More than 40, you're good. Ratio of interactions. You want at least 3 positive interactions to 1 negative. So if that's what you have, great. If you're getting to a 1-to-1 ratio, then you want to maybe think about doing an intervention with your interactions. And if you're less than 1 per minute, so if you're giving more negative than positive, then that's a problem. And then you can also look at disruptions from the kid. More than 10 disruptions, then he or she is really disrupting your class. 5 to 10, medium, and fewer than 5, maybe a light. And then I do have an example of how you can actually do this, or you guys can look up the Basic 5 observation form, and you can see, here's an example of just one that's been filled out. So here's your teacher, the activity, the benchmark. So this is the ratio of interactions, opportunities to respond, and disruptions. So we can see with our ratio of interactions for this child, there's 7 positive for this child and teacher, 7 positive, 2 negative. So 7-to-2 ratio, she's good. Opportunities to respond, 22. So they are in that kind of medium range. So she might want to give more opportunities to respond. Disruptions 1, so really good. And here's some type of, I think this is probably partial interval recording. And so you can actually see on-task behavior, I think this one was. So yeah, on-task or engaged behavior. And you can see they're engaged about 93% of the time, which is really good. So overall, this teacher has done great. The only thing that they could improve are their opportunities to respond. So you guys might want to look up the Basic 5. Think about all these different things with engagement, the ratio of interactions, those positive relationships between your students, the problem behavior, and the time on task. So this kind of encompasses some ways to measure how much the kids are engaged, how much they're responding, your interactions with them, and how many problem behaviors they have during your lesson. And it kind of gives you some benchmarks to measure, okay, do I really need work? Am I doing great? And things like that. All right, guys, so today we talked about children with EBD and how they typically have lower academic skills. We talked about the 3 categories of academic interventions. We talked about some strategies used to teach basic academic skills. We talked briefly about the universal design of learning, briefly about accommodations and modifications, briefly about reinforcement. I just wanted to remind you guys to not forget about it. And then finally, your opportunities to respond and how you can use them to measure, and how you can use those 5 benchmarks to measure all these things that we talked about, how engaged your students are, how many problem behaviors you have, are they responding, and things like that. So, all right, guys, if you have any questions about this module or the chapter, then please email me. Thanks, guys.